For decades, northern Florida lived in the shadow of its southern neighbor. While Miami, Orlando, and Tampa dazzled with beaches, nightlife, and endless growth, the north was mocked as unlivable, a swampy, storm-ridden stretch of land with little to offer. Outsiders laughed at its hurricanes, its quiet towns, and its lack of shine.
The time it gets closer to Florida, if it goes on this track right here.
But just 4 years later, that laughter stopped. What seemed inhospitable began to look like a refuge. Rising housing costs, climate challenges, and a changing economy pushed people to re-examine the very region they once ignored.
There are many reasons why people are drawn to Florida.
Of course, the climate.
The truth hit hard with a slow realization that maybe this place was never unlivable at all. The story of northern Florida is not one of glamour, but of survival. The Forgotten North. For generations, Florida's image has been painted with sunlit beaches, gleaming skyscrapers, and theme parks that draw millions from around the world. But those visions belong almost entirely to the South. Miami's cultural glamour, Orlando's booming tourism, and Tampa's expanding economy came to define what outsiders thought living in Florida meant. In contrast, northern Florida lingered in the shadows, a quieter, more rugged region that seemed worlds apart. Early perceptions of the North carried a certain inevitability. Its landscapes were dominated by wetlands, sprawling pine forests, and marshes prone to flooding. Hurricanes made frequent landfall, carving scars across communities that never had the financial cushion to rebuild as quickly as the South. Where Miami projected luxury and opportunity, northern Florida carried the label of hardship. Outsiders mocked it as unlivable, a land too wild to tame and too remote to modernize. These stereotypes took root during the state's developmental boom of the mid-20th century. Southern Florida flourished with heavy investment, drawing retirees, businesses, and international attention. Meanwhile, the North remained largely rural, dotted with small towns and long stretches of farmland. Without the same infrastructure or investment, progress slowed. Population density lagged behind, creating the perception of emptiness, isolation, and neglect. The cultural divide reinforced the contrast. Southern Florida embodied cosmopolitan ambition, Latin rhythms, international business hubs, and a pace of life designed for global recognition. The North, by comparison, was viewed as a backcountry. Its slower rhythm, fewer job opportunities, and history tied to agriculture made it seem out of step with modern growth. For those measuring value by glass towers and expanding skylines, northern Florida became shorthand for what Florida was not. But there is a deeper reason everybody mocked northern Florida for being unlivable. For outsiders, the region symbolized nature's dominance over human ambition. Vast wetlands resisted development, hurricanes leveled homes without warning, and industries struggled to gain traction. Investors chose the South, where the risks seemed smaller and the rewards greater. By the early 2000s, northern Florida carried the weight of decades of dismissal, whispered as the part of the state better left forgotten. Yet in those overlooked stretches lay something quietly enduring. The very landscapes mocked as inhospitable thick forests, freshwater rivers, and wide-open farmland were also sources of strength. Communities adapted to storms with resilience, living not in defiance of the land, but in cautious cooperation with it. The stereotypes ignored this truth, painting the region as failure rather than survival. Northern Florida's reputation as the Forgotten North did not emerge by accident. It was shaped by an imbalance of investment, of attention, of narrative. While the South basked in the glow of development, the North carried the weight of being left behind. And so, for much of modern memory, outsiders laughed, pointed to hurricanes and isolation, and declared it unlivable. But history has a way of turning quietly. 4 years ago, forces beyond glamour and growth began shifting the state's balance, and the region once dismissed as irrelevant would soon force everyone to look again because the truth hit hard. Nature's wrath. If northern Florida carried a reputation as unlivable, much of it stemmed from the land itself. Nature here was not gentle, it was raw, untamed, and at times unforgiving. While southern Florida basked in the marketing of sun and sand, the North was known for storms, flooding, and an ever-present sense that the ground could turn against you at any moment. Hurricanes often made their first strike on the Panhandle, hitting towns like Pensacola, Panama City, and Destin, with a force that seemed almost personal. Unlike Miami or Orlando, these communities lacked towering skylines, dense infrastructure, and the financial cushion to speed recovery, so the aftermath often lingered for months. Streets were littered with fallen trees and power lines, homes were flattened or heavily damaged, and schools and local businesses sometimes took years to reopen. For instance, Hurricane Michael in 2018 devastated Mexico Beach and parts of Panama City, leaving entire neighborhoods uninhabitable and forcing long-term rebuilding with limited state and federal support. Smaller towns, without the attention and investment that larger cities attracted, often relied on tight-knit local efforts, highlighting the vulnerability of northern Florida to such storms. For many watching from the outside, the question echoed with ridicule: who would want to live there? Flooding added another layer of hardship to northern Florida's already challenging environment. Rivers like the Apalachicola, Suwannee, and St. Johns often swelled with heavy rains, spilling over their banks into farmland and small towns, reshaping landscapes overnight. In places such as Tallahassee and Gainesville, low-lying neighborhoods were routinely cut off, roads disappeared beneath rushing water, and crops in peanut, cotton, and cornfields were ruined in a single storm. What outsiders saw as chaos, locals recognized as a recurring cycle, enduring the loss of property, livestock, and livelihoods year after year. Even infrastructure repairs, from bridges to levees, lagged behind in smaller counties, making each flood a test of community resilience. Then there were the sinkholes, those sudden yawning chasms that opened without warning, particularly in areas like Ocala, Gainesville, and the inland panhandle. Entire houses, cars, and even stretches of road could vanish in minutes, leaving residents in shock. To those unfamiliar with northern Florida's geology, it seemed like a curse, but beneath the surface lies a vast network of limestone and underground aquifers, slowly carved by flowing rivers over millennia. When heavy rains or shifts in groundwater erode the limestone too quickly, the ground gives way. In 2013, a notable sinkhole near Tampa in the northern outskirts swallowed a home entirely, highlighting the danger. While scientists emphasize that this is a natural process, for locals,
and the state of Florida is the sinkhole capital of America, so it's not surprising.
Every collapse reinforced the feeling that the land itself could not be trusted, adding yet another reason why development and large-scale housing remained cautious in the region. From the outside, the mockery was relentless. Headlines portrayed northern Florida as doomed by geography, as if its storms and sinkholes marked it unfit for human settlement. The state's north was cast as a place of survival rather than living. And yet, within this so-called cursed landscape, resilience grew. Families rebuilt after storms not once, but many times. Farmers adjusted to flooded seasons by rotating crops and working with the rhythms of the land. Communities adapted, not by ignoring nature's wrath, but by respecting its cycles. Where outsiders saw only disaster, locals cultivated endurance. This is the paradox of northern Florida. A land mocked as fragile, but inhabited by people whose strength came from facing fragility head-on. The storms carved more than destruction. They forged identities. Each flood and hurricane became a test. Each sinkhole a reminder that survival here demanded respect for forces beyond control. For those who ridiculed, the idea of building a life in such a place seemed foolish. But for those who stayed, the truth was different. The land was not cursed, it was demanding. And in meeting those demands, a hidden strength emerged. One that, years later, would prove that the mockery was short-sighted. The truth hit hard, not in the storms themselves, but in the realization that resilience had been mistaken for weakness all along. Hidden advantages. For years, the story of northern Florida was one of disaster and derision. It was painted as a land cursed with storms, poor infrastructure, and endless swamps. People laughed at the idea of living there, certain it could never compete with the glittering skylines and tourist havens of the South. Yet beneath the surface of ridicule lay a truth that outsiders rarely noticed. The very land mocked as unlivable carried advantages that southern Florida could not match. Geography gave the North a resilience disguised as hardship, while the South packed its population along narrow coastlines, vulnerable to surging seas and hurricanes. The North stretched inland, buffered by forests, rolling hills, and high plateaus. These landscapes were not glamorous, but they offered something far more valuable: room to adapt. The rolling hills of the Red Hills region and the pine uplands of the Panhandle helped reduce flood risk by directing rainwater naturally through the terrain. Northern Florida's underground aquifers, including the Floridan Aquifer and its vast freshwater springs, such as Waukulla, Ichetucknee, and Silver Springs, made the region one of the most water-rich areas in the United States. While hurricanes, floods, and sinkholes challenged life above ground, this abundance of freshwater became a hidden safeguard, supporting agriculture, wildlife, and resilient communities. Farmers relied on these resources to irrigate peanut and corn fields, and towns could rebuild more sustainably after storms, giving locals a lifeline that outsiders often overlooked. The soil told another story. In southern Florida, sandy ground often struggled to hold nutrients, forcing farmers to rely heavily on fertilizers and costly maintenance. By contrast, northern Florida's earth was richer, capable of supporting agriculture with fewer inputs. What once seemed like empty fields of rural isolation began to look like a lifeline. Crops thrived in the deeper soils, feeding communities even as global supply chains wavered. The land written off as backward was proving to be a source of quiet strength. And then there were the forests. For decades, outsiders mocked the thickets of longleaf pine, oak hammocks, and cypress wetlands as obstacles to progress. Developers complained that they blocked urban sprawl, standing in the way of roads and subdivisions. But the very trees that were once dismissed became shields in times of crisis. Their roots stabilized the land, their canopy softened storm impacts, and their wetlands absorbed floodwaters. Even their timber and natural resources offered a form of security when modern systems failed. They were not barriers, they were guardians. In towns like Tallahassee and the Panhandle, residents learned to respect the longleaf pines and cypress swamps that surrounded them. These natural defenders quietly shaped daily life, offering protection, resources, and a sense of continuity amid uncertainty. Biodiversity added yet another layer of resilience. While the South focused its economy on beaches and tourism, the North harbored something less visible but more enduring: living corridors of wildlife, freshwater sanctuaries, and complex habitats that scientists now call ecological treasures. Endangered species found refuge here not in spite of the harshness of the land, but because of it. The wilderness that outsiders laughed at as too stubborn to tame became a natural inheritance that gave communities both identity and protection. Over time, the irony became impossible to ignore. Everything once mocked, dense forests, heavy rains, fertile soils, was transforming into survival tools. Meanwhile, the crowded coastlines of Miami and Tampa began to crack under the weight of overdevelopment, rising seas, and saltwater intrusion. What had been considered the swamp no one wanted revealed itself as a reservoir of stability and endurance. And when conditions shifted, the reversal stunned many. The land thought to be a burden became an asset. The people once pitied for clinging to hardship became pioneers of resilience. For decades, the narrative had been one-sided, driven by mockery and dismissal. The truth hit hard. Northern Florida's supposed weaknesses were, in fact, its greatest strengths. 4 years later, a shift in reality. 4 years can change everything. The mockery faded as economic, social, and environmental pressures reshaped the choices people were forced to make. Suddenly, the land dismissed as unlivable became a destination for those who could no longer endure the costs of the South. Southern Florida, long celebrated for its beaches, nightlife, and cosmopolitan growth, began to suffocate under its own success. Housing prices soared beyond reach, climbing year after year until ownership felt like a dream reserved for the wealthy. Insurance costs, fueled by storm after storm, rose so sharply that even middle-class families found themselves priced out of security. For many, survival in Miami, Tampa, or Orlando became financially crushing. The glamour that once defined the region started to look like a gilded cage, shiny on the outside, suffocating within. By contrast, Northern Florida offered affordability that suddenly seemed like salvation. Land prices, once dismissed as laughably cheap, began drawing families, retirees, and even businesses seeking a foothold away from chaos. Small towns that had struggled against population decline felt the pulse of renewal. Abandoned storefronts glowed again with new signs. Cafes reopened, schools filled, and communities that had once whispered of survival now found themselves planning for growth. What outsiders once called forgotten was slowly becoming a story of rebirth. But economics told only part of the tale. Climate migration played an equally powerful role. In the South, rising seas crept into coastal neighborhoods. Saltwater intrusion tainted drinking supplies. Hurricanes battered high-density urban corridors with greater frequency and severity, leaving scars that even money could not quickly heal. Life there began to feel precarious, as if one storm could dismantle everything. In the north, despite its own floods and tempests, higher ground and inland buffers offered greater stability. The forests, rivers, and rolling landscapes provided a sense of protection, absent in the crowded south. Families sought not just cheaper living, but security shelter in landscapes that had long been mocked as wild and unpolished. The wilderness, once dismissed as irrelevant, now appeared as a shield against fragility. The irony was impossible to miss. For decades, everybody mocked Northern Florida for being unlivable. But just 4 years later, the very critics who had dismissed the region now sought refuge there, drawn by the strengths hidden in its soil, water, and space. The truth hit hard, not in dramatic headlines, but in the steady, undeniable shift of people, money, and opportunity northward. Communities once trapped in decline discovered themselves at the center of transformation. New schools were built where classrooms had once closed. Hospitals expanded to meet demand from swelling populations. Local governments that had struggled to provide basic services now found themselves managing growth and infrastructure challenges. The reversal came quickly, reshaping landscapes, economies, and identities in ways few had anticipated. Yet the change was not a fairy tale. Northern Florida still carried hardships, storms, economic limits, and the weight of its rugged environment. But compared to the fragile illusions of southern cities, its challenges were manageable. Its resilience lay not in avoiding struggle, but in enduring it. The conclusion became inescapable. What had been ridiculed as a swamp of impossibility had proven itself a proving ground for survival. The land had not changed. What shifted was the way people saw it. And in that shift, Northern Florida forced the world to reconsider its assumptions. The past judgments no longer fit. The forgotten North was forgotten no longer. And for many who arrived seeking refuge, the irony settled deeply. What was once mocked as unlivable had become the place where survival took root. Lessons in survival. Northern Florida's story is not just about geography, it is about the resilience written into its people and its land. For decades, the region was overlooked, mocked, and even pitied. Outsiders saw hurricanes, floods, and empty stretches of wilderness where development seemed impossible. But what the last 4 years revealed is that survival often emerges from the very places once underestimated. When the cost of living in southern cities spiraled beyond control, Northern Florida became a lifeline. Families fleeing rising rents and crushing insurance premiums discovered that adaptability was more than a choice. It was the essence of survival. What began as desperation slowly turned into renewal. Farmers who had endured reputations of failure found their soil producing food for swelling populations. Small towns once dismissed as relics of a bygone era began showing the quiet strength of self-sufficiency. What was once written off as unlivable transformed into a living lesson. Those who adapt, endure. The land itself mirrored this resilience. Its forests, rivers, and wetlands, so often mocked as wild or untamed, proved to be assets in a shifting world. While the South struggled with overcrowding, rising seas, and dwindling water supplies, the North held freshwater reserves, fertile soils, and space to grow. Nature had always provided the tools. All it needed was necessity to reveal their true worth. What outsiders had labeled a curse became, in time, a shield. Economically, Northern Florida's transformation exposed a broader truth about survival in unstable times. Dependence on luxury, glamour, and rapid expansion as seen in southern hubs proved brittle under pressure. By contrast, simplicity and adaptability created stability. Jobs tied to farming, small-scale industries, and local trade may have seemed modest compared to high-rise finance or tourism, but they endured when larger systems cracked. The very mockery that once defined the North became the reason it thrived. It had never been built on illusions of endless growth. For generations, Northern Florida lived under the shadow of dismissal, unlivable, backward, forgotten. That perception shaped not only how outsiders viewed it, but also how residents measured their own worth. Yet when survival demanded a different perspective, the region revealed a strength that had been hiding in plain sight. Being underestimated had given it time. Shielded from the crushing weight of overdevelopment and unchecked sprawl, it preserved the space and resources to adapt when others faltered. Neglect in its own way became a hidden strength. This shift was more than regional. It carried lessons for the wider world. Northern Florida, once the subject of laughter, became a symbol of adaptability in an era where stability is fragile and illusions shatter easily. The legacy of mockery and renewal. Even after 4 years of change, after families had moved north and farmers had revived once dismissed lands, the old stigma remained. Northern Florida was still whispered about as unlivable. The label had sunk deep into public memory, reinforced by decades of jokes, headlines, and dismissive portrayals. The media had painted the region as a place of storms, swamps, and struggle. For many, those images lingered longer than the new reality unfolding before their eyes. It is the strange nature of human memory. Reputations stick even when evidence begins to erode them. A single storm, a single struggle, can leave an imprint that outlasts years of resilience. And so, while Northern Florida grew stronger, its name still carried shadows of mockery. Outsiders who had never set foot in its forests or spoken to its people often judged it based on myths rather than truth. The irony was unmistakable. Those who laughed the loudest were often the first to arrive when survival demanded it. The role of the media cannot be ignored. For years, the stories told of Northern Florida were ones of failure, destruction, and poverty. Rarely did headlines speak of its rich biodiversity, its freshwater abundance, or the quiet determination of its people. Instead, it was the forgotten region, a backdrop for disaster coverage. Even as migration shifted northward, old reputations proved hard to rewrite. The world prefers simple narratives of thriving cities in the south, hardship in the north. Complexity does not travel as quickly as a catchy headline. Yet beneath that lingering stigma, renewal was taking root. Families who had once fled began returning with new eyes. Small communities, once invisible, became hubs of resilience and cooperation. Farmers who had nearly abandoned their land saw it bloom again. And while outsiders still carried outdated images, those living in Northern Florida began shaping a different identity. One not dependent on how others viewed them, but on the truth of their endurance. This is where the region becomes more than just a place on the map. Everybody mocked Northern Florida for being unlivable. Northern Florida, once laughed at and brushed aside, has become a striking reminder that resilience often hides in the least expected places. For years, outsiders saw only hurricanes, sinkholes, and swampy land, calling it unlivable. Yet in just 4 years, everything changed. The very challenges that once drove people away became the conditions that shaped a culture of endurance and quiet strength. Families returned, communities rebuilt, and the landscape revealed resources many had overlooked. The transformation was not loud or glamorous. It was steady, rooted in survival and adaptation. And while the stigma of being unlivable still lingers, northern Florida now carries a legacy of renewal that few could have predicted. If northern Florida's natural hazards, hurricanes, floods, sinkholes, kept its population lower than the south, yet its landscapes and water abundance provided hidden resilience, do you think the very challenges that discouraged large-scale settlement might become the region's greatest strength in an era of climate change? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.